session. I hope everyone sticks around. In 1 minute, we're going to have a panel on the National Academy of Sciences' most recent report that was funded by Arnold Ventures. Thank you, Julie and Arnold, called The Limits of Recidivism, Measuring Success After Prison. So we will bring that panel up actually now. It's 3 o'clock. All right. So let's see, we need Elsa and then we need Bob. There we go. All right, so we are now moving into our next panel, and our panel will be facilitated by one of our doctoral students, Teneshia Thurman. Teneshia has been a doctoral student, and I don't know, Teneshia, have we worked together like 4 or 5 years? It's hard to count.
Yeah,
long time.
around there.
So Teneshia is going to facilitate this conversation. I recommend anyone who has any questions for the panel to use the Q&A. Teneshia and or I will monitor that. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Teneshia, to introduce the panel and get the conversation going.
Thank you. Right. Hello, everyone. So welcome to our feature panel on the National Academy's report on the limits of recidivism and measuring success after prison. The National Academies put together a multidisciplinary committee that examined the measurement and the evaluation of success among people released from prison. The committee evaluated the strengths and limitations of the current measurement of recidivism, and they looked at so much more also in terms of regarding desistance. And just as a personal note, as someone who's read through, I would say 90% of the report, even though this, the title talks about measuring success after prison, I believe that a lot of the things that the committee has come up with and their recommendations extend well beyond just people released after prison. I believe it's intuitive to anyone who has gone through the criminal justice process. So we have Dr. Rosenfeld, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Apel as members of that committee to talk to us about that report. So I'll let them introduce themselves, and then I'll ask some of my first questions regarding the report.
Thank you. I'm Rick Rosenfeld, and I had the opportunity to chair the committee, National Academies Committee, that looked at the limits of recidivism and measuring success after prison. And Elsa Chen and Bob Apel were two of the stalwart members of that committee. As was mentioned, it was a diverse committee in terms of background, discipline, and experiences. I think one of the hallmarks of our committee, and indeed our report on recidivism and outcomes after release from prison, was that we had the benefit of committee members who worked closely with persons who had were formerly incarcerated. We had a committee member who himself was formerly incarcerated. We had a listening session with formerly incarcerated people, and so the lived experience of persons who have experienced incarceration and reentry directly played just an enormously influential role in the committee's deliberations, and if you have a chance to look at it, you'll see in our report. So the committee had 2 tasks set before us. One was, and in fact, the title of the report encapsulates the 2 tasks. We were to take a critical look at this idea and measure of recidivism. And we ended up pointing quite directly at many of its limits. And secondly, we were to look at the correlates of success for persons who leave prison and don't return. And those, when I talk about success or progress, we're not simply talking about the avoidance of subsequent criminal activity, but also progress across a host of multiple life domains. Progress with respect to family attachment, community engagement, employment, education, mental, emotional, and physical health, housing, personal well-being. So we tried to broaden the scope of what's typically looked at in research and commentary on the experiences of persons who have left prison. The typical focus is on the question, well, did they go ahead and commit more crime? And while we don't view that as an unimportant question, it is simply not the only important question we want to ask about the experience of people who have left prison. Just for general information, what is recidivism? Recidivism, as it's commonly measured and understood, is a return to crime on the part of people who have left prison. Now, return to crime actually is not measured directly by commonly used recidivism measures. What's measured is whether the person was rearrested, whether the person, if rearrested, was convicted, whether, if convicted, the person returned to prison, or if the person returned to prison not for having committed a new crime, but for having violated the rules of supervision they were under when they left prison, so-called technical violations like flunking a drug test or not showing up to a meeting. So recidivism, in other words, means many different things depending on the measurement. In general, however, it is supposed to tell us something meaningful about a return to crime. Both as in concept and in practice, there are many drawbacks to our current understanding of and measurement of recidivism. One drawback, perhaps the most basic one, is that it doesn't tell us anything much about a return to crime. Someone may be rearrested, but rearrest rates depend not simply on the underlying behavior of the person arrested, but also on arrest policy and arrest frequency that can vary across communities, within a city, across jurisdictions. And so we have to be careful when we think about recidivism as a, quote, return to crime. First and foremost, it is or is not measured by an arrest. And of course, if we're going to measure recidivism by arrests, not to mention convictions and reincarcerations, those measurements miss all those cases in which new crimes have occurred, but they went undetected by the criminal legal system. There are many other drawbacks to the concept of recidivism. Let me just mention one, additional one. Recidivism is typically measured, almost always measured, in a binary way. You either have been rearrested or you have not been rearrested. You have been reconvicted or not. You have been reimprisoned or not. You know, you get a 1 or a 0 in the standard measurement. The committee concluded, based on a good deal of quite good research, that measurement, which is quite crude, that binary measurement, really misses some of the most important aspects of the diminution of crime that occurs for many after they leave prison. The research I'm referring to is usually goes under the rubric of desistance research. Persons who desist from crime do so typically in a process that often involves setbacks. So a person may be committing fewer crimes, but does commit one on the way to committing even fewer crimes. And so what we argue in the report is that the standard recidivism measures need to be augmented at the very least with measures of desistance. How frequently does the individual commit crime after leaving prison? How serious are those crimes compared to the crimes that the person might have committed prior to going to prison? What's the length of time between the commission of crimes? Think of desistance as you might think about the recovery process from illness, disease, or addiction. We know that in all those cases, recovery can involve setbacks, even if ultimately it is successful. That's how the desistance literature would have us think about the cessation of crime after leaving prison. And that's certainly how our report would ask policymakers, journalists, the general public to think about the cessation of crime after leaving prison. Secondly, we were asked, as I mentioned, to think about life after prison in a much more multifaceted way than simply desistance, either in terms of recidivism or desistance from crime. There's much more to life after prison, to put it bluntly, and too little attention has been devoted to the progress or lack of progress that people make once they leave prison across multiple and important life domains. So what happens to the employment experience of people who leave prison? What happens to people who had educational deficits and are attempting to overcome them? What about physical, mental, and emotional health of people who leave prison? These life domains and many others are important in and of themselves, quite apart from what they might tell us about the person's propensity to commit new crime. And a good bit of the research, as Elsa is going to discuss, has to do with progress or lack of progress, barriers, structural and otherwise, in those multiple domains. So finally, and then I'll yield my time, I was asked to just summarize the major recommendations of our report. And let me do that right now. So we want to ensure that if we're going to continue to use this concept measure of recidivism, we do so in a more precise and accurate way. So measures of recidivism should specify exactly what is being measured and what is being left out. The exact actions taken by criminal legal authorities with respect to an individual. So is it arrest? Is it revocation? Is it conviction? Is it reincarceration? Or some combination of those? Every report on recidivism that uses common measures of recidivism, we argue, should be accompanied by clear statements of the limitations of the data used or that underlie the measurement. Those who are in the business of generating recidivism measures and indeed consuming them should ask for or generate supplementary measures that get at the process of desistance and go well beyond these binary measures of recidivism. Secondly, researchers should review existing measures and, as needed, develop new ones to evaluate post-release success or progress across the multiple domains that I've mentioned: personal well-being, education, employment, housing, family and social supports, civic and community engagement, in addition to legal involvement. Thirdly, researchers should review existing measures and, as needed, develop new ones with respect to those features of a community that facilitate and those features that block post-release success across those multiple domains. And that information on facilitators of success and challenges to success should reflect the particular needs and experiences of historically marginalized populations. And finally, we call on multiple federal agencies and private foundations to convene interdisciplinary research panels to assess the data, methods, and recommendations for measuring post-release success, to request grant proposals from researchers and practitioners in collaboration with formerly incarcerated persons, to review existing measures of success and develop and validate new ones, and to consider questions relevant to the measure of post-release success in existing surveys, such as the American Community Survey and data collection efforts in other domains, such as education, labor, and health. And again, private foundations, we argue, independently of or in concert with public agencies, should be a part of this process. So there are specific aspects to this final recommendation, but one I want to call attention to is the committee's recommendation that uniform national standards be developed for measuring post-release success. Not to take the place of the local standards that meet local needs, but certainly to supplement them so that we can make meaningful comparisons across data sets and across jurisdictions with respect to life after prison. And with that, I'll yield my time to Elsa.
Actually, I'm going to turn it back to Teneshia because maybe you had some questions for us.
Go right ahead.
Sorry. Well, I actually was going to direct my next question to Dr. Apel.
Oh, okay.
So Dr. Rosenfeld went through the report very well and the recommendations, but can you kind of break down some of the issues that you saw in terms of, you know, positives or negatives or, you know, whatever that you guys saw in terms of measuring recidivism?
Happy to do that. Thank you very much, Teneshia, and thank you for having me on this panel along with Rick and Elsa and Faye. I'll try to dig a little bit more deeply into some of the comments that Rick got us started on, and that is, you know, that many of us think of recidivism as a measure of the effectiveness of the criminal legal system. And it's often the case that reentry programs rise or fall on the basis of their success at reducing the recidivism of participants. And so one of the things that on the committee we really tried to devote our attention to is asking the question of what do people mean by recidivism? How is this used in practice, in research and in practice? Now, as Rick mentioned, it generically refers to commission of disallowed behavior within a specified window of time by individuals who have been sanctioned in the criminal legal system. So it's most often measured from criminal justice registries, and this includes arrest records provided by law enforcement, conviction records provided by the criminal courts, prison admissions provided by court and correctional agencies. Now, although there's no such thing as a national recidivism rate, many people are familiar with the Bureau of Justice Statistics reports. And one of their recent estimates was that 82% of individuals released from prison in 24 states in 2008 were rearrested within 10 years of their release. So this is although there's no national recidivism rate, this is the recidivism rate or something like it that frequently gets thrown around when discussing not just the criminal legal system, but individual risk when they leave prison and return to the community. Now, we know that already that recidivism, although it's frequently thought of as a return to criminal behavior, it need not refer to commission of new criminal offenses, and in some cases might refer to violation of technical conditions that are not themselves unlawful, but can lead to some form of punishment for individuals who are under community supervision. In government reports and research papers, thus, the term recidivism is used to describe an array of time periods and actions by the criminal legal system. That includes rearrest or reconviction or reincarceration within a window of 1 year or 3 years or 5 years, and so on. And so the view of the committee, as Rick mentioned, is that greater precision is warranted to provide some clarity about what's actually included under the recidivism label. Now, one of the chief limitations of recidivism, no matter what action or time period are measured, is that it treats reentry success, as we've heard already, as an either-or state. Someone either recidivates or they do not. So thus distills many shades of gray to overly crude black and white distinctions. And I'll try to provide some more specific illustrations of that. First off, binary measures of recidivism mask very different frequencies. So for example, someone released from prison who is accused of a single violation within a window of time is treated the same as someone who is accused of 20 violations within the same time period. These imply very different patterns of behavior. A second example is that binary measures of recidivism treat very different allegations as equivalent behaviors. For example, they treat rearrest for misdemeanor assault as equivalent to rearrest for armed robbery. Now, both are technically violent offenses, but they obviously differ greatly in their severity and the public safety risk they represent. And yet a third limitation is that binary measures of recidivism overlook distinctions as to the timing of alleged behavior. So for example, someone who is not accused of a violation until the last month of a 3-year reference window is treated identically to a person accused of a violation within the first month of their return to the community. So as we've heard already, the committee really discourages the use of measures of recidivism that are binary in nature. We encourage more focused efforts to measure distinctions like frequency and severity, as well as the degree of clustering and the length of time between alleged offenses. Now, even efforts that classify recidivism offense types as to whether they are violent, property, drug, or public order violations, while they get a little bit at the question of the severity of the behavior, they nevertheless overlook a great deal of heterogeneity within offense categories, as we saw with the comparison between misdemeanor assault and armed robbery, both of which are violent offenses. So the committee also recognizes that the context of release from prison matters greatly, and the measures of recidivism currently in use are not equipped to measure variation in those contexts. Some communities are better resourced than others and have more abundant opportunities available, and are thus better able to serve the needs of individuals returning from prison. Some communities are also more heavily policed than others, and a particular behavior might trigger action by the criminal legal system in one community that would not do so in another. So it's thus important to acknowledge that official measures of recidivism that are the most widely used capture more than an individual's level of risk. And I think it's worth pointing out that none of this comes as news to professionals who work with returning individuals. In listening sessions with many different stakeholders, these included probation and parole officials, reentry service providers, and even the commissioner of a state department of corrections. More than one person commented to us that recidivism measures lack context, and many would prefer to set them aside altogether, or at the very least do away with singular reliance on them as measures of success. One person even told us, this was the commissioner of a state department of corrections, and I quote, "Recidivism is a measure a failure to measure success. So I think it's important to remember that these stakeholders care much more about broad indicators, and I know Elsa will elaborate on those further.
Right, thank you. Dr. Chen, if you will allow me just to give this quote, and I will give the link in the chat box, but if anyone wants to read the report themselves, there's also a really great webpage that's like an interactive webpage, and they actually have some quotes from people that have helped them with their report. And there's one in particular that I would like to read and then ask Dr. Chen my question, which I believe kind of leads into that. And it's by John Alvagarada, the CEO of Youth Build USA. He says, "For me, success is not about being out of prison and struggling to survive, or out of prison but homeless, unemployed, living in constant fear of judgment and rejection from the world, or addiction to substances and without a network of support and caring, positive people. For me, success is experiencing a sense of belonging, worthiness in society. It's about the sense of belonging and feeling you can contribute to society and that you are accepted." So with that, one part that I loved about this report, and that's just based on some of my own research that I love, thinking about desistance. So for Dr. Chen, I have a two-part question for you. One, what did the committee find in terms of issues with desistance? And then the second part is thinking kind of beyond that aspect of desistance in terms of well-being. Some of the same things that John Valgarada said, like, it's about me being accepted into the community. It's all of this stuff. So if you can contribute to that.
Sure. Thank you, Teneshia. And also thank you, Faye and Danielle and Cameron and our other hosts at George Mason. Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. It's very important. And I do want to emphasize that I think for all of the members of the committee, one of our favorite parts of this process was the listening sessions, where we really heard from the folks who were directly impacted and the people who work with them and people who are victims and people who work in the correctional areas. So, we learned so much from them, and it was deeply humbling. In addition to talking about desistance, I will go on to talk about the need to go well beyond desistance and talk about well-being. So as Rick mentioned, desistance from crime is a process, and it can't be captured adequately in a binary measurement, just like the way that recidivism can't be a binary measurement. Formerly incarcerated people can make a lot of progress while also experiencing mistakes and setbacks, just as we all do when we're trying to make progress. And those setbacks really shouldn't be regarded as failures, but maybe more like obstacles to success that might be temporary and can often be overcome. And at the same time, and I think the quote that you read, Teneshia, really highlights this, we often overlook the fact that people who've desisted from crime are not necessarily thriving or even surviving in other very important ways. An individual can be crime-free while still lacking a safe and stable home, employment, family ties, community ties, political and civil rights, and physical and mental health. So we need to sort of change the lens from looking at what people are not doing, which is how recidivism and desistance really focus. What are people not doing? They're not committing crimes, but rather what they are doing or what they are achieving. And when we received the charge as a committee, we were asked to look at multiple meanings and measures of success after prison. And the key word was success. With that in mind, we really devoted a lot of attention in the report to looking at post-release progress and improvement across multiple life domains, including physical and mental health, employment, and not just any employment, but quality of employment, housing, family attachment, community involvement, things like that. And both our own research and presentations that we heard by subject matter experts, which included people with lived experience of incarceration and practitioners who work with them, all of that convinced us that it was really essential for folks to have this sense of hope and efficacy and well-being, self-confidence, and the ability to contribute to society. Those things were really important when it came to successful reentry after prison. It's also really important, and we really gained this from listening to a lot of folks, to consider the really wide diversity of individual experiences. And as Bob mentioned, we really have to consider the environments into which people are returning and the structural and institutional supports and impediments that characterize those communities. So one thing that we really learned was there's no one size fits all measure of success, right? For example, people who come from historically marginalized groups and are returning to communities with very few resources, lack of affordable housing, jobs, treatment, counseling, things like that, they're going to struggle more to find stable housing and employment and health. We learned that, the needs and resources are really different in Alaska versus New York City, or in rural areas versus cities and suburbs, or in impoverished areas versus wealthy ones, right? It's different from a cis, straight, Black man to, trans, gay, Latina individual. These experiences are highly individualized. So we have to consider both very individualized measures of success and, importantly, the contextual factors, right? The assessments of success after reentry have to be really multifaceted then, and nuanced and holistic. And with that in mind, as Rick mentioned, chapter 4 of the report discusses a lot of survey instruments and sample questions that could help capture well-being across many domains. And a lot of these are self-reported, self-reported measures of self-efficacy and confidence and, happiness, things like that. We also think that qualitative assessments of progress, including interview and ethnographic data, are very valuable along with statistical measures. Both kinds of data are really important, legitimate, and valuable. And so now we have this challenge ahead of us, right? Given that we've identified these shortcomings and the direction we want to go, the challenge to scholars and practitioners is to develop and validate measures of personal well-being that are both reliable and sufficiently flexible to encompass all of these diverse experiences, backgrounds, identities, and contexts that face those who are leaving prison. So Teneshia, I think I'll just turn it back to you for any follow-up questions that you have. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Anyone in the session, please ask your questions through the Q&A. But I do have a personal question. Thinking about, when I was looking at the document, you have I think six or seven domains of reintegration. One of them is housing and homelessness. And another one specifically that just kind of jumped out to me is civic engagement and voting. Knowing that there's been even laws passed this year, depending on which state you're in. And some of these domains that you have are so grounded in law and policy. How would you recommend people, someone maybe like myself, who might want to go into policy making, or people who are ingrained in laws and policy makings, think about the issues that you found throughout your report?
One thing I would say is, not to avoid your question, which is actually a crucial one, that our task was to focus on measurement, right? And so we tended to avoid broad-based recommendations or characterizations of whether, for example, this or that policy was effective in supporting reintegration of persons leaving prison, because that was beyond the scope of our task. But we didn't completely avoid the kinds of issues that your question raises, especially in the final chapter of the report. I simply want to say that faulty measurement serves no good public service, right? No good policy is based on faulty measurement. So while better measurement is not sufficient to generate better policy, it's certainly a necessary foundation for better policy. What do we hope policymakers will do, if that's part of your question? Certainly take measurement more seriously and call for federal agencies, the research community, and others to invest time, invest resources in improving the measurements that we have of life after prison. That doesn't guarantee good outcomes. It doesn't guarantee an increase in social justice. But without better measurement, I don't think we're going to make much progress at all.
I can also jump in a little bit. Teneshia, you spoke of separate domains, like criminal justice is one domain, housing is another one, civic engagement and voting is another one. And I think as practitioners and academics, we often think of, silos like that. But if we speak to folks who are living after incarceration, they don't experience things like that, right? It's all one thing in their life. And so I think that it's important that researchers and practitioners and policymakers engage more deeply and with more openness and humility with formerly incarcerated individuals and the people who work with them and victims and other people with relevant lived experience, because then it's really obvious how all of these things overlap and intersect and work together and interact in any given individual's life, right? It's so easy to compartmentalize when we're scholars, but I think when we look at the way folks experience, the different policy domains, it's unrealistic. It's an unrealistic way to think about them as different segments. And so I think related to sort of the methods that we use as scholars and practitioners and government officials and policymakers and things like that, it's important to make sure that formerly incarcerated individuals are invited and included and heard and respected and empowered in the work that directly affects them, because the way that we tend to think about it is kind of artificial.
Yeah. And will policymakers, do you believe policymakers will take this report and try to justify certain changes that they're in terms of funding for new programs? And I guess for me, there's, sometimes when I'll work on a project with Dr. Taxman, it's like we have our intent, right? And I feel like a lot of us always have our intent of what we hope to make this product. Have you even also thought about maybe some negative consequences of how your report will be taken in terms of policymakers?
Well, I think most of us would say that if it's ignored by policymakers, that's a negative consequence, right? So, we're doing what we can, speaking in forums like this one and other ones, to get the word out. It's hard for me to say just where the various issues that we highlight in the report currently rank in terms of policymakers' priorities. clearly there's a concern with an uptick in serious crime, right? And to the degree that we're calling for better measurement of crime and other criminal legal system involvements after leaving prison, that emphasis certainly is in keeping with the discussion and debate about crime. Whether that means policymakers are going to move forward on each of our recommendations is, remains an open question. But we're going to try to get this in front of as many relevant audiences as we can.
And so earlier in our discussion, our very first person for today was the dean of the Shar School. And, he talked about how there's, a lot of undergrads and graduate students who are going out into the policy world, right? So to extend on what Dr. Rosenfeld said, like if you could, and as someone who is getting her PhD, who kind of shifts between academic and policy making, is there something from what you've learned throughout your report that you would say, if you could take anything from our report, whether you go into academics or policy making, this is what we want you to keep in the front of your mind in terms of talking to people, in terms of changing the idea of recidivism and desistance?
Bob, Elsa?
Any advice to me?
There's one theme, I think at the very least, it's a subtext that runs through the entire report. And there are a number of places where the committee explicitly references this. I think aligning oneself with organizations, community organizations, I think is a great way to get some exposure to some of this on the ground knowledge. I think the practitioners are really out in front of this already, in my view. This came from, Faye and I had paired up and had some listening sessions with a number of people who worked within the criminal legal system, maybe on probation or the parole side of things. And so even people working within the criminal legal system, but those who are actually on the ground and working face to face with individuals returning to the community, have a lot of expertise and are already leading the effort in this, but those efforts don't necessarily make their way into the grant proposals that we write, for example. So I think there's a great deal to be learned from teaming up with organizations that serve returning individuals, teaming up with organizations of returning individuals themselves. So I think that's something that I think underlies the entire report that I think it's important to pay close attention to.
Yeah, I really agree with Bob. And I want to add that, as a student or a practitioner, it's really easy to use the data that are available and convenient. And, recidivism is maybe easy to measure, but focusing on recidivism is not only not helpful and inaccurate, but it leads to decisions that maybe are not the best use of public resources and maybe don't necessarily enhance public safety if that's our exclusive focus. And so even though it's less convenient to do self-reported surveys and things like that, or ethnographic or qualitative research, those forms of data, as well as multifaceted data, including lots of different policy domains, which are very difficult to gather, those would really help keep people safer and use our taxpayer dollars and public resources more effectively, and help formerly incarcerated people enjoy a better quality of life. So, as a student, it's really often hard to do something that's time consuming and expensive and requires, years and years of work. And so I wouldn't necessarily put that on folks who are working on a PhD or something. But our report is trying to change the way the entire field talks about it. And if enough people agree to contribute to that effort, I think we really can make a shift and create better policy.
Agree. And I guess my last question to you comes from something that Brian Loynes from our session right before us, and he mentioned something that I thought was very interesting. And he kind of suggested that there's this notion of social justice and criminal justice being counterintuitive, right? Or like they don't necessarily match up. So my question to you is, how do you see like the measurement of recidivism and the idea of looking at desistance in terms of not only how we measure desistance, but in what Dr. Chen said in terms of like seeing it in a broad sense. Do you see the two working together, or do you see that maybe some ways in which we look at criminal justice reform and social justice as very different and counterintuitive to each other? Or how do you think that we can combine the two together? I know that's like a big convoluted question, but.
That's a comprehensive example.
She's way past her comms.
I don't necessarily see criminal justice and social justice as inevitably opposed to one another. I think that in my own view, those of us who are part of the discussion of reforming criminal justice come at those at that discussion, think about those reforms very largely in terms of, well, how can we promote more social justice in the criminal legal system, right? And so I completely understand the very expression criminal legal system reflects in part, though we use it as a purely descriptive phrase in our report, but reflects in part misgivings about the characterization of the current system as one that necessarily or consistently promotes justice. So, that's at the level of language, but language can make a difference. And so there's a case in which social justice has, I think, nudged in a positive way the criminal legal system and the way we think about it. So I wouldn't necessarily think the two concepts are always or inevitably opposed to one another. We want to make sure that the criminal legal system reflects the best principles of social justice.
And I think without social justice, you're endangering the legitimacy of the criminal justice system, right? It's important that we consider not just punishing people who do bad stuff, but rehabilitation and reentry as big important pieces of the criminal legal system. In a prior presentation, about this report, I actually read a quote from the vision of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And that says that successful reentry will be realized when, quote, through the provision of healthcare, mental, spiritual, educational, vocational, and work programs, inmates are prepared for productive and crime-free return to society. So we're not just trying to make sure people don't commit crime. We want people to be productive and contribute to society, which is good for everybody. It's not just like a favor we do for people who are incarcerated. It's good for our social health and our economic health as a country.
If I could, I love the way you characterize that, Elsa. I think that's terrific. And I would just add on to that, that there's almost an instinctual focus on recidivism. So much of our discussion and policy is focused on risk. So it's a risk-focused discussion. And that's partly for historical reasons, but I think there is beginning to be a shift that's observable, at least in a number of different contexts, even though it might not be really widespread at the moment, to really shifting focus to an asset as opposed to deficit focus. And I think that ties in quite nicely with some of Elsa's observations as well, that these shifts are underway. And the rhetoric aside, sometimes the way that we talk about the criminal legal system, or at least policymakers talk about the criminal legal system, is quite different from the way that the criminal legal system is actually practiced by people who are the frontline workers. And my experience is people at the front line are actually far more social justice oriented, the ones who are actually working with individuals who are entangled in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if there's any questions.
So, how do we help our discipline as researchers really think about moving away from the easy ways of measuring recidivism, which is the dichotomy, it happened or it didn't? What is it that we as researchers, besides practicing what we preach, can do within the American Society of Criminology, in our training for students, that we could do to really foster and help people understand the importance of quality measures?
Have everyone including all of your students, read our report would be
Okay, good point.
a good first step. All of us act as peer reviewers, right? We review articles for journals, and this is just one mode of influence. But the next time we see an article that uncritically uses the recidivism rate, either as a cause or an effect of something, we should come back as reviewers and say, there's been a good bit of criticism of recidivism in the way in which you're using the term and measure. And in revision, you should take account of this literature, this critical literature, and expand your understanding of recidivism. So that's one way, in addition to our teaching, that we can make a difference in the research.
We can support and sponsor research that uses the more nuanced and comprehensive and complex measures. And then, going back to your point before, Teneshia, it's not easy for students or most scholars to turn to other sources of data than the ones that are available and collected by the different agencies and shared. So I think as we, as scholars, develop new measures and new methods and everything, we have to try to share those things, right? Sharing is caring. And if we care about accurate and comprehensive measurement, then we really should collaborate to try to develop, these national standardized measures of success.
And this idea of dissemination, I really have to second that. In one of the conversations that Faye and I had with someone who worked within a state correctional system, he made an interesting observation that hadn't really occurred to me, but I think it illustrates nicely the slippage or the gap that continues to exist between academic researchers and people who work at the front line. And we, as researchers, we take for granted this idea of desistance. I mean, it's something that's been researched for decades now. It's been, the term has been around for quite some time. But this one individual from a listening session made an observation to me, and he said that desistance is a conference term, and that's not yet common in the applied field. I think that's actually a challenge for researchers as well to keep in mind, that a lot of what the kinds of things that we talk about, we're frequently talking about to each other, and we're talking about to each other in scholarly venues and peer-reviewed journals. So it's important to bear in mind that even the words that we use for things are not necessarily accepted nomenclature outside of academic and scholarly settings. And so I think it's important to be able to use the words and to speak the lingo that's actually used in practice. So but I think we really do have some real challenges here.
That's really important, Bob. And also we have to be precise. So desistance or recidivism, just those terms in and of themselves don't really have any meaning.
Right.
If we're talking about, the number of times a person committed a new offense with a conviction in a 3-year period following their release from prison, right? Well, we should say that, even though it's a mouthful. It's definitely a lot more meaningful than just saying recidivism.
Right. An interesting question to contemplate is why Robert Martinson's phrase "nothing works" and his initial research received so much attention over decades. One reason is it connected with the zeitgeist of the time. I think when Martin produced that work, there was increasing concern and skepticism about the limits of corrections and so forth. So the question for us is whether our report is connecting with a new zeitgeist. And to some degree, I think it is. Certainly within the last couple of years, there's been more discussion of criminal justice reform writ large than for many years prior. And a good bit of that discussion, think of all the critical discussion of mass incarceration. A good bit of that discussion has been directed at the correctional system. The reentry revolution has occurred in recent years. So, if there were ever a time for a report like this to make a dent, I think we're living in that time.
Well, thank you. I know we have one question in the queue. We have 4 minutes left until Dr. Ruse talks about her wonderful book, but I'll go ahead and ask it. Bruce Turnbull asks, I would appreciate the panel's comments on the following. Senator Grassley is using differential recidivism rates according to a report from the United States Sentencing Commission between those who were convicted of crack cocaine related offenses and those who were convicted of powder cocaine related offenses as justification for opposing legislation to bring the sentences between these two offenses to an even levels. So it's not necessarily a question, but a comment in terms of, I think that, they're trying to say, there's a lot of different things that are happening in terms of policy-wise of how we look at people and their convictions, and then how should we see them when they come out of prison, right? Should we see someone who's has a cocaine offense, who may have been in for 15 months versus someone who's been in for a crack offense who's been in there for 36 months, right? So I think that goes into what you guys have talked about in terms of how do we think about policy and law in terms of recidivism and things of that nature.
Well, if Grassley were here, I would ask him to consider the following, which is the vastly different punishment schedules for crack and powder cocaine haven't really done much to reduce recidivism on the part of those who were convicted of crack-related offenses, right? So if you're going to use recidivism rates seriously in this case, you have to ask, well, why hasn't that much more extensive and intensive punishment reduce the recidivism on the part of those convicted for crack? So I'm not, here's another case in which recidivism rates are being misused.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Rosenfeld, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Apel for this wonderful conversation. And in the chat, there's a link to the report. I recommend everyone go and read it. Think about how they can use the recommendations in their own field, whether you're a student like myself, maybe wanting to go into academics or into policy, or you're already into policy. Think about how you can think about these issues, especially in terms of thinking about a person holistically, right? They're not just black and white. They're not just they committed a crime or they didn't commit a crime. Think about their well-being and, how they have come to success in their journey. So thank you. And our next panel will be up shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.